If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help keep us bring you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Austen. Today we're diving into the wonderful witty world of Jane Austen, one of the most beloved and enduring authors in English literature. With her sharp social observations, sparkling dialogue, and timeless tales of love, class, and family, Jane Austen has enchanted readers for over 2 centuries. And in 2025, as we mark 250 years since her birth, there's no better time to revisit the life and legacy of this literary legend. Especially now with the BBC One drama Miss Austen capturing hearts all over again. From her cultured childhood in the Hampshire countryside to her later years in the bustle of Bath, Jane's life was every bit as fascinating as her fiction. But who was she? It's funny, Jane Austen's name, to me, almost feels more famous than the actual woman herself. But here's the short version. Jane was born in December 1775 in Steventon, Hampshire. She died in 1817 at the young age of 41. And in her lifetime, she wrote 6 novels, each one a classic: Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. Stories that we still read and adapt and absolutely adore today. But I think to understand the writer, you have to start with the home that she came from, the home that shaped her. Jane was the 7th of 8 children, 6 brothers and just 1 sister, Cassandra, with whom she was famously close. Their father, Reverend George Austen, was the rector of Steventon and a massive influence in her life. The family weren't rich by any means, but what they were rich in was ideas. The house was absolutely full of books. They had over 300 in their library, lively conversation, and amateur theatricals. Jane and Cassandra were encouraged to read and to write, and more importantly, I think, than anything else, to imagine. Something quite unusual for girls at that time. Her nephew would later call Steventon the cradle of her genius, and I think it's easy to see why. Daily life in the Austen household? Picture this: a noisy, imaginative, tight-knit family. Some brothers went off to sea, others joined the church. Her favourite, Henry, dabbled in everything from banking to the clergy. But at home, the evenings would have been filled with stories and skits, entertainment by candlelight, performed by all the Austens themselves. I think you could safely say it was their version of Netflix. And with her father tutoring local boys to help make ends meet, Jane and Cassandra actually soaked up lessons just by being in the very room, and they were allowed to be in the room that lessons were being taught. They may not have had much formal schooling, but they had access to something I would argue is much better: a home buzzing with curiosity, creativity, and support. It's no wonder Jane started writing early. Witty sketches, short stories, and even whole novels by her teens. Look, there was no career plan, of course, for women. Women weren't supposed to be writers. But I don't think Jane really cared about supposed to. She had something to say, and she found her voice in the drawing rooms and the hedgerows of rural England. So join me as we follow her on this journey, from Steventon to Bath and beyond, from rejected manuscripts to literary immortality. This is the life of the sensational Jane Austen. Austen didn't grow up in a cultured household. She grew up in a lively one. Steventon was full of friends. It was full of neighbours. It had an open door policy. There were visiting students and, of course, the extended family. In many ways, it was kind of a rural salon of conversation, of music, of home theatricals. It's really hard not to romanticize it. Honestly, it was a home full of books, imagination, magic, and words. Always words. And at the center of it all, Jane and her sister Cassandra. They were incredibly close. From the moment Jane was born, their bond was very clear. Their father even described baby Jane as a plaything for Cassie, which actually says a lot about their affection. And throughout their lives, they were almost inseparable. They were certainly best friends, they were confidants, they were soulmates in sisterhood. Even when they travelled or visited friends, they were usually together. And on the odd occasion when they weren't, they wrote to each other constantly. Those letters are now some of the most valuable windows we have into Jane's daily thoughts, her humour, and her observations. And it's really no surprise that Jane became a writer. She started young, really young. Literally, as soon as she was able to hold a pen, she was writing. Short stories, comic sketches, outrageous mini dramas. Her early work, her juvenilia, if you like, is full of mischief and cheeky flair. And there's one story she wrote called The Beautiful Cassandra. And it's wild, it's cheeky, it's a little tale that's both absurd and brilliant. It's gloriously unhinged. And I would say it's probably written in her early teens. Another standout of very early work is Lady Susan, which is a short novel in letters about a cunning, seductive widow who manipulates everyone around her. Jane wrote it when she was about 16 or 17, and it's rather wicked for its age. It's actually rather wicked now, but it's also bold and sharp and surprisingly adult. You know, even at that age, her characters were already full of life. They were complex, they were flawed, and more than anything, they were fabulously entertaining. One of my favorites is something that Jane and Cassandra collaborated on, which is a spoof called The History of England. Jane wrote it, and Cassandra illustrated it with watercolors. It's quite beautiful, and it's very rare in its original condition. But at the start, Jane declares, and I love this, there will be very few facts in this history. It is a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant account. How amazing is that? You know, the sense of play, that dry, sideways humor, it's there from the very beginning. So what do these early writings tell us about her? They tell us that Jane Austen was funny. She was genuinely funny. She was witty. She was incredibly observant, and she was clever. And I think also totally unafraid to poke fun at people, at conventions, you know, even at herself. She had an incredible eye for detail and for the oddities of human behavior. And while some of the period references can actually get lost on us today, the humor actually still pokes through and sparkles, especially when it's being performed. And that's why screen adaptations of her work so well. They remind us how much comedy lives in her characters and dialogue. And like many young writers, her early work was a little wild, a bit chaotic, full of drama and flair. But as she matured, her style became more refined. She began editing ruthlessly, sharpening her wit, tightening her prose. You know, the first drafts of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice were likely written when she was just 20 or 21 years old. Already, she's crafting the kind of storytelling that would shape generations of readers to come. And yet, through it all, I don't think she ever lost that twinkle. You know, that blend of realism and romance and razor-sharp social observation. It was there from the very beginning. And it's also one of the most important reasons as to why she still speaks to us some 250 years later. So then I wondered, what would those early manuscripts have been like? You know, it's a lovely thing as a historian to imagine historic figures. And I can imagine Jane Austen in her early 20s writing what would eventually become Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. You know, those first versions were probably livelier and more dramatic, and perhaps also a bit more chaotic. You can see the shift when you compare them to her later novels. By the time she's in her 30s, she's lived more, she's lost more, and that maturity starts to show through. Her edges are smoother. The characters are much, much richer. The humor is still there, though, which I love, But the swashbuckling kind of flair, if you like, of her juvenilia gives way to something more grounded and something more refined. And this is what Austen is so highly regarded for, this extraordinary ability to observe the world around her and distill it into fiction that still feels incredibly fresh today. Look, I'm actually trained as a historian and I'm not trained in English lit, but I find Austen's novels such an incredibly fascinating resource. They're fiction, yes, but they're deeply rooted in reality. Women who are smart and capable, but legally and socially stuck. Families dealing with inheritance laws that leave them financially insecure. People worrying about marrying well, not just for love, but for survival. These weren't far-fetched storylines. They were real concerns, finely wrapped in wit and style. I think what's even more fascinating is how universal these themes are. You strip away the bonnets and the carriages, and what are you left with? Money, love, family dynamics, social pressure, the search for identity. Doesn't all this sound so familiar today? And that's why these novels still resonate. And then I wondered where this insight came from. Well, it all started in Hampshire. Jane grew up in a small, close-knit community where people knew each other's business, where friends and neighbours dropped by constantly, and life revolved around the parish and the rhythms of that parish and countryside. That environment completely shaped her writing. Think about it. Her stories are so driven by character, by conversation, by social nuance. There's not a lot of physical description in her work. You get to know the characters by how they speak and how they behave. And that's become classic Austen. She observed people as they were, not how they appeared. And of course, then came Bath. The Austen family moved there in 1801, and it was a big shift. Bath was a bustling social spa town, a place to see and a place to be seen. It had its very own energy, it had its own rhythm, and Jane was thrown right into the crux of it. But I have to say, it wasn't all balls and promenades. It was also a time of great upheaval. Jane's father died in 1805, and suddenly everything changed. The family now, without his income, had to depend on her brothers. Jane's security vanished almost overnight. And perhaps that's why she didn't write much during those years. For a few years, there's very, very little creative output. But Bath does appear in two of her novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, and in both it plays a pivotal role. In Persuasion, the heroine, Anne Elliot, who's often seen as Austen's, I suppose, most mature and introspective character, finds love again in Bath. And to me, that says something about Bath. Despite the personal losses and the disruption, there must have been something about Bath that Jane found hopeful, or maybe at the very least redemptive. So while it was a quieter writing period, it was also an incredible turning point. It gave her more experience. It certainly gave her more layers. And by the time she picks up her pen again, the stories that she tells are deeper, wiser, and filled with the kind of clarity that only comes with that lived experience. After their time in Steventon, the Austen family moved several times within Bath itself. Each move reflected a quiet downward shift, living in smaller houses in less fashionable parts of town. And it's actually easy to trace the changes in their circumstances just by the addresses. And for Jane, who had grown up in a strong sense of home and community in Hampshire, Bath would have felt like a very different world. Eventually, after her father's death, Jane, her mother, and Cassandra left Bath altogether, and they moved in with her brother Frank in Southampton just for a short time. But it wouldn't be until a few years later, in 1809, that Jane actually found something close to stability again, when her brother Edward offered them a cottage in Chawton, back in Hampshire. That cottage Now, the Jane Austen House Museum became her final and most creative home. So, yes, Bath would have been a turbulent time. It would have felt unsettled, uncertain, but also filled with contrast, lots of colour, and new experiences. It must have been thrilling in parts too. To live in an urban centre, to observe the shifting social scenes, not just as a visitor, but as a resident. That's something Jane carried into her writing. And while we don't see huge creative output from her during those Bath years, as I said, her novels do return to it. Northanger Abbey and Persuasion both take place partly in Bath. And I think what's fascinating is how she writes about it. Certainly not with rose-tinted glasses, but with her usual blend of sharp humour and subtle affection. She captures both the charm and the vanity of Bath society. There's sparkle, there's satire too. I've been to Bath many times, and at one stage I lived quite close to it. And every time I went, it made me think about her just a little bit more. I used to assume that she didn't enjoy it very much, but after rereading Persuasion, it made me think again. Her heroine, Anne Elliot, finds love and hope in Bath after all. So perhaps even through the grief and the uncertainty, there was something about it, something about the place that lingered kindly in Jane's memory. And today, it feels right, I think, that Bath actually honours her as one of its most famous residents, because in many ways, I think she captured the city in that time better than anyone. Without her father's income, Jane and her family faced what so many single women of her time feared: financial precarity. They didn't quite belong to the working classes, but they also couldn't earn a steady living. Her brothers could enter the Navy or the church. Jane couldn't. So she, her mother, and Cassandra moved between relatives' houses, often staying for weeks or months at a time. They were, in a sense, genteel dependents, which was actually a common, uncomfortable position for women of that era. During those years, Jane became deeply involved in the lives of her many nieces and her nephews, and she had about 30 of them. She was known to be a warm and witty aunt, and many of the children actually grew up treasuring their time with her. She wrote to them often, she stayed with them often, and she helped raise them. Those family connections meant absolutely everything. Cassandra, too, had a small income of her own. She had once been engaged back in the 1790s, but her fiancé died before they could marry. Because their engagement had lasted so long, Cassandra was entitled to a modest family annuity from his estate, which obviously helped, though only just. It was absolutely a very hard time, but also one that shaped Austen's later novels in subtle, powerful ways. Her characters often hover on that same social edge, women with wit, with sense, with depth, but with limited means. They're not poor, not exactly poor, but their futures always hang in the balance. And that tension, that blend of class dependence and dignity becomes one of her most brilliant recurring themes. By the time Jane Austen moved to Chawton in 1809, her life had been in a kind of holding pattern, financially unstable, emotionally uncertain, and always reliant on the goodwill of the family. And look, while Jane was close to her family, especially her brothers, and of course Cassandra, it couldn't have been easy. Relying on relatives, never quite knowing, where you might be living next. I think it would have been a delicate, precarious existence. Jane actually had a very small private income, but nothing that could support her mother, sister, and the occasional friend who stayed with them. They still maintained an open-door policy, even though they were relatively poor. They certainly needed help, and as I said, that help finally came from her brother Edward. Edward, interestingly, had actually been adopted in his teens by wealthy relatives who had no children of their own. Something surprisingly common at the time, especially among landowning families, eager to pass their estates on to someone respectable and capable. Edward actually took their name, which was Knight, and inherited several properties. And of course, one of them was Chawton House, and just down the road from Chawton House was a very modest cottage. That cottage became Jane Austen's home, and I have to say, her sanctuary. Edward offered it to Jane and her mother Aunt Cassandra in perpetuity, and for the first time in years, they had a roof over their heads that they could truly call their own. And almost immediately, something remarkable happened, and it gives me goosebumps when I think about this. Jane began to actively write again. She went back to her old manuscripts. She revisited them. She dusted them off, refining them, editing them with the sharpness and elegance that we now associate with her absolute best work. Within 2 years of arriving at Chawton, Sense and Sensibility was published. And here's where it gets heartening for all those writers out there, because even Jane Austen struggled to get published. Can you believe it? I mean, it's so hard to imagine a writer of this caliber not being accepted. She was to become one of the most beloved authors in the English language, whose works, I think, have been translated into dozens of other languages and adapted into countless films and series. To think that she was rejected, it just blows my mind. A very early version of Pride and Prejudice, then called First Impressions, was sent to a publisher by her father in the late 1790s, and it was actually returned by post, which they had to pay for. I find that so delicious. And there was no explanation. The note enclosed just read, "No thanks." She later sold another manuscript, Susan, the very early version of what would become Northanger Abbey, when she was about 25. And a notice went out announcing that it would be published, but it never was. And because she had actually sold the rights, she couldn't actually do anything with it. And she spent years trying to buy it back. And eventually, with her brother Henry's help, she did. So when Sense and Sensibility finally came out in 1811, it was a huge moment because she didn't put her name on it. It said simply, "by a lady." Believe it or not, this was actually quite common at the time, especially for women. Her next novel, Pride and Prejudice, was published by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Again, no name, just small hints, and I love this. And so it went for her next two novels, Mansfield Park and Emma. Anonymous to the public, but quietly celebrated by her and her family in private. In her letters, Jane jokes about how proud her brother Henry is. He told everyone in the social circle that his sister wrote these books. So certain people did know, the world didn't know, not until she died. In 1817, shortly after her death, her final two novels, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, were published together, and for the first time, they bore her name. Her brother Henry included a short biographical note. "The author of these beloved novels was my sister, Jane Austen." And just like that, the world was introduced to the real woman behind these words. So the next question I had was, how were these books received in her lifetime? Were they well received? Well, they were, but they were quietly received. They sold reasonably well. They certainly weren't runaway bestsellers, but they were successful enough to encourage reprints and, more importantly, to keep writing. And look, she had some famous fans too. Prince Regent, who later became George IV, was one of them. He even asked her to dedicate a novel to him, which she dutifully did, Emma, though I can't help but think that she rolled her eyes privately. It's only later, in the decades following her death, that her reputation began to rise, and rise, and rise. Those Chawton years, from 1809 to 1817, those were her golden years. She was writing, she was happy, she was secure, and she was quietly, steadily building a legacy that would eventually one day outlive her by centuries. It's one of the great ironies of Jane Austen's life that one of the most enthusiastic fans was the Prince Regent. who happened to be a man that she quietly couldn't stand. Supposedly, the Prince Regent kept copies of her novels in every one of his residencies, and when Emma was published, he requested that it be dedicated to him. Well, requested might be putting it politely. It was more of a instruction. So I would say that she did it, but not with enthusiasm. In truth, she disapproved of him deeply, particularly how he treated his wife Caroline of Brunswick. Jane Austen, as always, had a sharp eye for personal behavior, and she didn't hesitate to judge poor manners, even in royalty. That being said, she was still invited to the Prince's Library at Carlton House in London, where she actually met James Stainer Clark, the royal librarian. And their correspondence is absolutely fascinating. You know, Clark, clearly a well-meaning flatterer, tried to encourage her to write something grand and historical, something suitably royal. Jane, as ever, replied with gentle defiance, and she told him quite firmly that a historical romance based on the House of Saxe-Coburg really wasn't her style. Jane absolutely knew her own voice. She knew what she wanted to write, and she wasn't about to be swayed, not even by princes and palaces. By the end of her life, Jane had seen real success. Her novels went into second and third and fourth editions during her lifetime. No, she didn't make a fortune, but she earned a reasonable sum, especially considering how hard-won it all was. After years of rejection, after years of disappointment and anonymity, she finally knew what it felt like to see her books out there, being read, being bought, and I think also being loved. As an author, there's nothing quite like walking the street and seeing someone who has your book in their hand and they're either reading it or using it. It's quite special. As authors, you kind of take that for granted that at some stage someone will be sitting there reading your book. But to actually come across someone reading your book is actually quite special. And I can imagine how Jane would have felt. That's when it really kind of becomes real. At Chawton Cottage, she actually lived very simply. She wrote at a small table placed underneath a window so she could actually observe the village goings on. That little table is still there today in the Jane Austen House Museum. And it's astonishing to think that every one of her great novels was shaped at that very unassuming spot. She was also unofficially keeper of the tea cupboard, a small but, kind of serious responsibility in a household where tea was actually precious and expensive. She held the key. I love that. And I can only imagine that she rationed it out very carefully. And I think it tells you something, doesn't it? That the woman whose words would travel across centuries was also making sure that the sugar didn't run out. In the evenings, they would read aloud. Jane, Cassandra, their mother, and guests would gather by the fire. When the author's copy of Pride and Prejudice arrived, Jane wrote about how they read the first half of the first volume aloud together. Can you imagine that moment? Jane holding her first published book, watching her mother and friends laugh and listen as her characters actually came to life. And I think that's the true magic of Jane Austen. Yes, she's an icon now. She's studied and she's quoted, adapted and adored, but she was also a woman who knew how to observe, how to laugh, how to write, quietly, daily, steadfastly, in between, boiling the kettle and unlocking the tea cabinet. So here's the perennial question. Jane Austen wrote some of the greatest love stories in literary history. But what about her own? It's impossible not to ask. She practically invented the archetypes that we still use in romance fiction today. Enemies that turn into lovers, friends to lovers, slow burn courtships, the unexpected proposal, the agonizing miscommunication. She gave us Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet and Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth. She set the standard. And yet, she never married. That simple fact has actually launched 1,000 theories. But what do we really know? There are, broadly speaking, three figures who seem to have been real candidates in James' romantic life. First up, Tom Lefroy. He was a relative of a neighbor and visiting over the winter when Jane was about 20. We know about him because he appears in one of her earliest surviving letters to Cassandra, and she talks about dancing with him too much. She jokes with him too much, and she calls him my Irish friend Paddy. The letter is playful and it's flirtatious and it's full of sparkle. But then he leaves, and she jokes again, kind of mock tragic this time, about being devastated. And it's actually hard to know how deep it really went. It might have been just a winter flirtation, but of course, he's the first name that she's mentioned. And because he was Irish and charming and probably quite handsome, he's become the romantic favorite, the supposed model for Mr. Darcy. Then there's Harris Bigwither. This one's fascinating. He was the brother of a family friend and the heir to a substantial estate. At age 26, Jane accepted his proposal of marriage, but only for one night. She changed her mind by morning, packed her bags, and left abruptly with Cassandra. It begs to question, was it obligation? Was it too much pressure? A moment of practicality that didn't sit right with her heart? Look, we'll never know. But what we do know is that Jane chose to say no in a world where saying yes would have meant comfort, security, and status. So that actually tells you an awful lot. Last but not least, there's the mysterious figure from Lyme Regis. According to family law, Jane fell for a man that she met there. Someone thoughtful, someone promising, a genuine connection. But before anything could come of it, he dies. His name and most of the details are lost to time. But the story lingered with the family as the one that might have been the greatest love of her life. So I guess the question comes to, why didn't she marry? But before we answer that question, let's just take a small break and hear a message from our sponsor, and we'll be right back. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270. Or visit their website, penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So the question, why didn't Jane marry? Some say she was holding out for a great love like the ones that she wrote about. Others suggest it was practicality. She saw what childbirth did to her sister-in-law, the physical cost of marriage, and she chose independence instead. Jane had dozens of nieces and nephews. She knew what married life really looked like. Joyful, yes, but also risky and exhausting, and at the time, not always kind to women. But here's what I think. I think she loved romance. You can see it in her letters. She flirts, she teases, she gossips with Cassandra about handsome men at dances. She jokes about being the only unmarried one at a dinner table, or being annoyed that all the attractive men are already spoken for. She enjoyed that world of flirtation, of glances around the room, of matchmaking and mischief. She lived inside it, and she understood it. And I think she didn't need to marry to write about love, because she understood it. She got it. In the end, Jane Austen chose something incredibly rare for women of her time. She chose independence. She may not have had wealth or a grand romance, but she had something more than that. She had her pen. And with it, she created love stories that have outlasted every suitor. Jane Austen had something rare and beautiful around her throughout her life. A strong, sustaining circle of women. Her sister, Cassandra, her mother, her nieces, her friends. In a world that often offered women so few choices, Jane actually found comfort in conversation and companionship and in this deeply female space. It wasn't romantic love that sustained her. It was this network of care and warmth and shared understanding. So I then wondered, do we actually see Jane Austen in any of her characters? For me, I've always imagined her as a little bit of Elizabeth Bennet, sharp, funny, always observing, occasionally a little bit biting. You read Jane's letters and she just bursts off the page. You know, she has opinions, she throws shade, she cracks jokes. She's someone you want at your dinner party, someone who actually sees everything and tells you exactly what she thinks of it. But of course, there are glimpses of her, I think, in many characters. Maybe Cassandra is the gentle yet loyal Jane Bennet. Maybe Anne Elliot, her quiet resilience reflects something of Jane's own later years. Maybe Emma, opinionated, meddling, lovable, was the indulgent creation Jane always wanted to write. As she said herself, she was trying to write a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. And that's both, I think, a challenge and a delight. I then wondered, did she have a favorite among her own books? And she never actually said directly, but we get clues. She called Pride and Prejudice her own darling child, writing to Cassandra after receiving her author's copy. You know, that image of her unwrapping that parcel and then cradling the book like a baby, it sticks with me. But Emma, too, seems to have held a special place in her heart. You can sense the fun that she had when she was writing it. And of course, Persuasion, which was written in her final years, has a depth of maturity and a depth of feeling that suggest something deeply personal. And those final years, well, they were difficult. We don't know exactly what illness Jane suffered from, though possibilities like Addison's disease have been suggested. What we do know is that by 1816, her health was clearly declining. There were periods where she was too unwell to write, though she still managed to finish Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. Her final novel, Sanditon, remains unfinished and actually abandoned when she became too sick to continue. In May 1817, she left Chawton for Winchester, hoping for better medical treatment. She stayed at 8 College Street, just steps from the cathedral. And on the 18th of July, with Cassandra holding her hand by her side, she passed away. She was just 41 years of age. She's actually buried at Winchester Cathedral, her gravestone silent on the achievements as a writer. It speaks only of her virtue, her kindness, her devotion to her extended family. But a brass plaque was later added, acknowledging her literary brilliance. And today, people from all over the world come to stand where she rests. So what about her letters, her thoughts, her words beyond the novels? Well, in fairness, Cassandra burned a lot of them. There are about 160 surviving letters, but we know there were once many, many more. And of course, back then, letters were absolutely everything, a daily communication, an opinion. They spoke of gossip, they were love notes, they were rants. And Cassandra, in the name of privacy, I think, to protect Jane, destroyed much of her sister's correspondence after her death. I can only guess at what was lost. But what remains, those novels, those few treasured letters, that unmistakable voice, it actually tells us so, so much. She was sharp, she was funny, she was observant, and more than anything, she was brave and unafraid to be herself. She saw the world as it was and imagined how it could be, not with grand declarations of sweeping romantic gestures, but with wit and clarity and compassion. She gave us Elizabeth and Eleanor and Emma and Anne, and she gave us Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion. And I think in doing so, she gave us herself. And that brings me to Cassandra, Jane's sister, her closest companion and the person who burned, many of those letters after Jane's death. Historians vilify Cassandra for making that decision. People actually argue that she robbed us of Jane's full voice, her unfiltered thoughts. But I think we're being very unfair. Cassandra loved her sister deeply. She lived on for 30 odd years after Jane's death. And during that time, she did everything she could to protect Jane's legacy. Not just the writer, but Jane the person. And here's the question you have to ask yourself. Would you want your private messages read aloud to the world decades after your death? Cassandra wasn't censoring greatness. What I think she was doing was preserving dignity. She also helped ensure Jane was remembered. So did their brother Henry, who wrote a biographical notice, to accompany the posthumous publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. Her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, later published the memoir of Jane Austen, which actually shaped so much of how the Victorian world saw her. A sweet, quiet aunt writing in a corner, clever but gentle, not threatening at all, not political, and I would also add, a little saintly. Writers like Devon Loser have explored how Jane became Jane Austen, an icon, a cultural touchstone, a shorthand for romance. And during World War II, soldiers suffering from shell shock were given her novels, believed to be soothing and grounding. During World War II, she was recast as an emblem of calm British resilience. And now, I don't know, well, she's everywhere, isn't she? She's referenced in pop culture, which has been reimagined for new generations. Her stories have been adapted into modern films, retelling period dramas, and, of course, Netflix series. Watch a show like Bridgerton, and the echoes are immediate. The lake scene with Anthony Bridgerton, that's straight out of the Colin Firth, Mr. Darcy playbook. And that scene, of course, is from Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We know the tropes, and of course, we feel the beats. And Jane Austen lives in it all. But what's most fascinating is how much more we're still uncovering. Today, scholars are reading Mansfield Park, through the lens of empire and slavery. In its first chapter, Jane Austen casually mentions that the Bertrams have a plantation in Antigua. It's very subtle. It's very easy to miss, but it's there. And of course, now people are paying attention to it because she did write about the world that she lived in, not loudly, not with manifestos, but with sharp little details, observations and nudges. She wrote about war, debt, class, gender, empire, and wrapped them all, I think, in love stories. And I think more importantly, she actually made her readers feel safe, but she also made them think. And maybe that's why we're still reading her today, because beneath the bonnets and the ballroom scenes, there's bite, there's nuance, there's someone who understood human nature so well and with such clarity. And that's why her work feels so fresh some 250 years later. So it's fascinating to trace how opinions around Jane Austen have changed over time, how she's gone from, being remembered as a quiet moral aunt in the corner to becoming a full-blown cultural icon. So I guess one of the last questions I had is, why does she remain so beloved today? For me, it's all about the resonance. Her novels may be over 200 years old, but the themes still feel strikingly modern. Relationships, meaningful friendships, social pressure, financial insecurity, trying to figure out what actually makes a life worth living. These are things that we still wrestle with. And Jane captures them with such clarity and such humor and such compassion. There's a solace in returning to her world. It feels familiar, and it makes us feel seen. And yes, part of the magic is that we only have 6 complete novels. That small, brilliant body of work invites so much curiosity, doesn't it? It's a bit like Leonardo da Vinci, so few confirmed works, and yet, an outsized impact. With Jane, the smallness of her collection only magnifies its power. We sit there wondering, what else might she have written? What else was waiting inside her before her life was cut so short? So, for anyone coming to Jane Austen today, where to start? Well, look, you absolutely can't go wrong with Pride and Prejudice. And look, I'll admit it, I'll always be Team Colin Firth and Jennifer Eel. That 1995 BBC adaptation is absolutely iconic. Andrew Davies nailed the tone, the pacing, and even lifted the dialogue straight from the book. Yes, there's a double wedding at the end and a kiss that Jane never wrote, but you know what? It captures the spirit beautifully. That said, I also really enjoyed the recent Emma, which was directed by Autumn de Wilde, and I think it starred Anya Taylor-Joy. I'm pretty sure it was Anya Taylor-Joy. And it's visibly stunning, and it's smart, and it's so funny. Exactly what Emma should be. And for something completely different, Pride and Prejudice. I absolutely loved it. It's the Bollywood adaptation, and it's full of joy and energy, and I think also proof how universal her stories are. Would Jane have liked any of these? Look, we can't really know, but I'd love to think that she'd appreciate the 1995 Pride and Prejudice for its faithfulness and its warmth. And maybe, just maybe, she'd have a soft spot for Clueless too. Clueless is clever, it's playful, and it totally understands Emma. And I like to think that she would be sitting at her table looking out and laughing out loud while she watched it. To finish on, I guess, what are the biggest misconceptions about Jane? The biggest one is probably that she only wrote little romances. And let me be clear on this. There is nothing wrong with a romance. It's an extraordinary genre that deserves far more respect. But Jane wasn't writing love stories. She was writing society, psychology, power dynamics, and family structures, and emotional nuance, all disguised in drawing rooms and dances. She observed people, I think, with forensic brilliance. And she used humor to expose hypocrisy. And she gave generations of readers, especially women, a voice that told them, your thoughts matter. Your world matters. And so do your feelings. She was funny, she was clever, she was bold in her own quiet, determined way. And even now, 250 years after her birth, she still has things to teach us about love, about resilience, and about the deep joy of noticing the world just a little bit more closely. Folks, thanks for spending the time with me. It's been a pleasure as ever. And when in doubt, I declare after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. Bye for now.